Hello, everyone. Jeffrey Nance here with you again. This is Word Wednesday. Glad to have you guys joining us. We are going to be switching topics here for a few weeks over to the topic of parenting. And it seems appropriate if we're going to talk about parenting to go back to the beginning. And so I'm going to start us off in Genesis here, and we're going to see kind of what God's plan is for parenting and for inhabiting the earth. And we're going to talk a little bit about how difficult a job that appears to be, even from the start. So I'm going to read uh, here for you guys in Genesis. And this is a passage that you're all familiar with, but as I was working my way through the Old Testament, it's almost kind of depressing if you start to look at what kind of results, I guess, if you will, that parents have had throughout the Old Testament. Now, one of the cool things about the Bible is that it doesn't hide those things from us. It's very transparent, whereas it might be something where if you were writing a book today, you say, "Hey, look, write write about this stuff, but don't include the messed up stuff." Well, you don't have to read very far in the Bible to find a bunch of stuff that's like, "Ooh, ouch, oh, ooh, that that was from God's people. Ow, ooh, yeah." So unfortunately, that's going to be the case for us today here too. But let's start out with God's desire here, and then we'll kind of see what happened from here. God blessed them being Adam and Eve, and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, and over every living creature that moves on the ground." So here we see that God says to Adam and to Eve. Now remember, here's Adam, and he's still missing something. So God creates Eve, and then Adam makes this very profound statement. He says, "This is now bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh." Which obviously, I mean, that doesn't seem like that's something that would come from him, because what would he know about a mother and father and then leaving them? I mean, is Adam and a bunch of animals, right? So Adam, a bunch of animals, and then he has the Trinity here that he's kind of hanging out with, and then managing this place. And then now here comes Eve. And then God says to him, "All right, be fruitful, multiply, and then inhabit the earth." So that is God's desire. That is God's plan, that a Christian man and a Christian woman would have kids, and that they would grow, that they would have families, and that they would teach those kids the right way, and that they would be ambassadors for Christ, sharing His word, sharing the mission, and then inhabiting the earth that God had provided for them, taking care of those things that God had provided for them, and then using those things that God had provided for them. Unfortunately, we don't have to go very far before we see less than desirable results with the kiddos. All right, so here's Adam, here's Eve, then here's Cain, here's Abel. And again, guys, we're all familiar with the story, but Cain kills Abel. I mean, it's the it's our first glimpse at parenting kids in the Bible, and the first thing we get is, yep, Cain killed his brother, and then they have another one named Seth. Like, what? All right, let this be a slight bit encouraging for those of you who are parents that are like, "I don't think my kids get along." Well, the first set of kids really didn't get along. Maybe a little bit extreme there, that they didn't get along, but they really didn't get along. And then I said, well, man, that's the first kind of example we have of parenting, and that kind of seems like that didn't go well. And then we kind of move through, and we don't see a whole lot really that goes on, but then we go out to Noah, right? So here's Noah, and God's going to destroy the earth, but he's set apart Noah and his family. All right, so Noah's got Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and those are the three boys, their kids, and then they're the ones that are rescued. Uh, and then as soon as they get off of this boat, then Noah goes and gets drunk. That's one of the first things he does. Come on, Noah, seriously? All right. Then one of his kids, Ham, walks up on him, sees him naked, and then doesn't really cover him up. And then there's signs here that maybe that's the kind of onset of some of the sinful behavior that we're going to see from the Canaanite people. In fact, when Noah wakes up, he hears what Ham has done, and then he curses not just Ham, he curses his kid, which is kind of a weird thing. Curses Canaan, and then we know all the crazy things that come from the Canaanites and their evil and debauchery that comes from that. I'm like, oh gosh. And again, this was someone that was set apart because the rest were worth that they needed to be destroyed. And here's Noah, and the first thing he does is like goes and gets drunk. And then he's naked, and then his kid is like, it's like, oh, okay. So then we move forward, and I'm like, all right. So then you look at the book of Kings, and you've got a king, and it's like their son becomes king. And it's like, this guy's a horrible king. And I'm going, oh, great. And then it's like all of a sudden you get these few good kings every now and then that pop up. And normally they come from like bad kings, like their dad was a bad king, but somehow they produced a kid who ends up becoming a follower of God that really leads the people to turn back to God. And that in and of itself is pretty fascinating. And I'm like, but man, more often than not, those guys did these events. So then we go and say, okay, well, what David? What about David? Was he good? Well, I mean, he's a man after God's own heart. But then we start looking at his kids, and we go, all right, so we got two kids that basically want to take over the kingdom from their father. They try to usurp his authority. And then we got another one that's sleeping with his concubines out in front of people, basically out on the roof of the Capitol building, if you will. And I'm like, oh, that's not good either. So what about the priest? Well, let's go to Eli. We got Eli, and they're like, no, his sons were terrible. It's like, yeah, somehow Samuel comes out of this, and Samuel's a great representative of God, and he's basically raised by Eli, but Eli with his own kids kind of messes up somewhere with them because the Bible talks a lot about them being not very good people. And I'm like, oh, great. So the more I read through this, I was like, wow, parenting is hard. But the Bible points out a lot of examples of kids that didn't seem to do well, and they came from a variety of families. And I look back at this and I say, okay, so if this is happening over and over and over, where are we missing something important? Because we know that the Bible tells us as parents that there's certain things that we're supposed to do. And we're gonna talk a little bit more about that next week. But there are things that we're trying to do, things that we want to instill in our kids. And as parents, I think often wrongly, we look at our kids and think, well, man, that somehow represents me. And so when we see our kids doing things wrong, we'll get on to them because we're like, hey, I don't want you acting that way because it looks bad for me. But the reality is that kid, that person that was created inside their mother's womb was uniquely created. And our desire, right, as Christian parents is to raise up kids who love Jesus and who want to live life in a way that is glorifying to him and that benefits other people. We don't know a whole lot really about Jesus' life. It's from about the time he's like 12 to 30, basically. His 18 years are summed up in this. And Jesus grew in wisdom, in stature, and in favor with God and man. That's what we know of Jesus for about 30 years. Or about 18 years. He grew in wisdom. He grew up in stature, meaning he got taller, he got bigger, and he grew in favor with God and with man. And so if I were to say, okay, so what would I like to accomplish as a parent? Well, obviously let's look to the example. That would be Jesus, not an example as a parent, but as a kid, being raised by Mary and Joseph. Um, so what does he do? He grows in wisdom. he grows in stature, and then he grows in favor with God and with man. And so as parents, I think that we look to that and say, okay, so what would I want my kids to look like? And what would I feel like is me being a good example of what God desired from the beginning for them to look like? Well, obviously, if we look back at some of these examples, we can see where some of these kids were not doing those things. They weren't growing in wisdom, right? That they weren't um, developing a relationship with God. They weren't thinking and putting others first. And so those are things that were taking root. So as parents, we would maybe raise our kids differently, but I would suggest that there are things that we ought to all have in common. And that would be this: encouraging our kids to love Jesus and to love other people and to grow in wisdom as they grow in stature and to grow in favor with God and with man, to be the kind of people that are able to do those things and to do them well. And we have a lot, a plentiful amount of examples of people from the Bible that did not accomplish those things. So one, I want you guys to see. Look, each one of your kids is different. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this next week. We have 4 kids of our own, and they're all very, very different. I'll talk more about that next week, but very, very different. And it's I'm pretty sure they were all raised in the same house, but they're very, very different. And so, what I want to encourage you guys to do is to realize, um, in this responsibility of being a parent, my ultimate responsibility is to still be a Christ follower, right? To to honor him, to lift him up, and then to do things that are an example of that, and to present an opportunity for my kids to be in an environment where they could grow in wisdom and stature and favor with God and with man. And then ultimately to realize that God created us with the ability to be our own individuals. And just like Cain, I'm sure, did not do what his parents desired to do. If you asked his parents, I'd be like Adam and Eve would say, yeah, we really don't want you to kill your brother. I think that's pretty obvious. They'd say, I don't want you to do that. And there were other things that I would rather you do, for sure. Right. And that's what happened. So we see even from early on, there was a struggle, right? There's this tension between, yes, God has set you apart, but you still have to do things in such a way that you live like him. Otherwise, you will be doing things that are the very opposite of him. And that can be true for our kids, that can be true for us as parents, that can be true for us as grandparents. But our main job is to try to live our lives in such a way in every area of our lives that we might hear these words from Jesus when we get to heaven. Well done, my good and faithful servant. And so the question I would pose to you guys as we close up today is, do you think that that applies to every area of your life? That we as Christ's servants should see each role that we partake, whether that's as an employee, as a boss, as a parent, as a kid, as a grandkid, grandparent, etc. Um, whatever your role is, as a friend, as a neighbor, do we see all those roles as an opportunity for us to serve Christ? And if so, how do we approach that? So let's look a little bit more into this next week, and to realize what a privilege and a responsibility is to try to raise up godly kids. One of the things that we at Tradeway realize is that teaching is a big part of this. We're going to talk next week about how we need to train up a child in the way that they should go. What does that mean? What does it mean to train? That's going to be our key next week. We're going to talk about this idea of training. When it says train up a child in the way that he should go, in the end he will not depart from it. What does that really mean to train something? Who trains? What does it mean to train? How does that impact us as parents or grandparents? So we're going to look at that next week. But in the meantime, how do we approach all of these things from a biblical perspective? And how do we maintain our influence over our kids? We're going to talk a little bit more about that. But we also have a resource we want to make available to you guys to help you out. And just realizing that, in school, our kids spend a lot of time in school. We drop them off at about 8 o'clock in the morning. We pick them up at 4. That's 8 hours a day. That's a third of their day that they are spending at school, being taught by people that we may or may not know. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit more about that over the next few weeks too. But in the meantime, I just wanted to make you guys aware that we have a resource available to you that's quite different probably than anything your kids are hearing certainly at school. But we think it's very, very important for our kids to have access to material that really teaches them from a biblical perspective how to think about different areas of life. And one of those things that we have available is called Raising Kingdom Kids. And we have some stuff available that we call the Little Builders. And this is a product that you guys can have access to. And if you want to learn more about that, you can contact support@tradeway.com. But it's a different way for you guys to really think through, teaching your kids about different things in life, maybe a different approach than what they would hear at school. So I want to encourage you guys to check this out. I'm going to post it over here. I think you guys will be able to see it, but here's the link there. If you want to learn more about that, you can. And it's called our Little Builders Program. And it's just a resource from a biblical perspective for you to just think about a lot of things differently, maybe than what the world is teaching. Capitalism. Why is that good? Why is it biblical? What does it mean to have an influence on other people? How do we look at education from a biblical perspective? How do we look at science from a biblical perspective? When we realize that God has created everything, that there's really nothing that we have to fear. So there's never going to be a discovery where all of a sudden we're going to be like, nothing surprises God, right? He's all knowing. So if anything, the more we discover about science, about the body, about creation, it just leads people back to this idea of a creator. So how do we approach those topics from a biblical perspective? That some of those things are covered in that Little Builders program, and it's posted up there for you. So if you guys are interested in learning more about that, go check that out. And join us again next week. We're going to look at this idea of training. The Bible says we're supposed to train up a child in the way that they should go. So what does that even mean to go through training? We're going to take a look at that. Would love for you guys to join us again next week. Thanks for being a part of Word Wednesday today.